The vacancy sign buzzed and flickered against the pitch-black desert sky, its faint glow barely noticeable until you were close. The Lone Star Motel sat alone on a forgotten stretch of highway, surrounded by miles of barren desert. No one came here unless they had to. I didn't plan on running a motel for a living. It wasn't exactly a career aspiration, but life has a funny way of twisting you into shapes you never imagined. After losing my job in the city and burning through every last dollar I had, I ended up here. It was supposed to be temporary, a way to scrape by until something better came along. 2 years later, I was still here, the last person standing between weary travelers and whatever strange things lurked in the desert. Mr. Givens, the motel's owner, was the one who gave me the job. He was an older man, thin and wiry, with a face that seemed permanently etched with exhaustion. He handed me the keys and a laminated sheet of paper with a list of rules on my first day. "This job's easy," he said, his voice gravelly. "Just follow the rules. Don't question them, don't break them. Do that and you'll be fine." I glanced at the sheet. The rules seemed strange, like some kind of prank. Guests must check in before sunset. Do not assign anyone room 6. After 11 p.m., do not leave the main office until sunrise. If you hear knocking on the office door between 2 and 3 a.m., do not answer it. If a guest checks out before sunrise, do not let them leave. "Seriously?" I asked, holding up the paper. "What is this?" Mr. Givens didn't smile. "Just do as it says," he said firmly. I wanted to press him for answers, but something about his tone stopped me. He wasn't joking. At first, I thought it was just superstition, some quirky tradition to match the motel's eerie vibe. But it didn't take long for me to realize the rules weren't just suggestions. They were the only thing keeping this place from swallowing me whole. The first few nights were uneventful. A couple of truckers, a family on a road trip, and a young couple passing through, all normal guests. I followed the rules, even when they seemed pointless. No one asked for room 6, and I made sure to stay in the office after 11 p.m., though it felt silly at the time. Then, on my 5th night, I learned the rules weren't meant to be ignored. A young couple arrived just before sunset. Their car sputtered into the lot, kicking up a cloud of dust. They looked tense, the woman clutching a paper map while the man scanned the horizon like he was expecting something to jump out at them. "We need a room," the man said. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed his unease. I handed him the key to room 3 and gave my usual spiel about checkout times. They didn't linger, just grabbed their bag and hurried off. It was around 2:30 a.m. when I first heard the knocking. It was soft at first, barely audible over the hum of the office's ancient air conditioning unit. I froze, my heart pounding. The rules flashed in my mind. If you hear knocking on the office door between 2 and 3 a.m., do not answer it. The knocking came again, louder this time. "Hello?" a woman's voice called. "We need help." It sounded like the young woman from earlier. My instincts screamed at me to open the door, but the rules kept me rooted to my chair. "Please, let us in," the voice pleaded. The desperation in her voice was gut-wrenching, but something about it felt off. It was too hollow, like a recording being played back through a broken speaker. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I sat there, clutching the edge of the desk, until the first rays of sunlight crept through the office window. When I checked their room later, it was empty. The bed was neatly made. The key was left on the desk, and there was no sign they'd ever been there. I thought about calling Mr. Givens, but what would I say? That a couple disappeared, and someone pretended to be them in the middle of the night? I told myself I must have imagined the whole thing, but I didn't imagine the next incident. A month later, a man in a suit showed up around noon. He was tall and imposing, with sharp features and a briefcase that seemed oddly heavy. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "I need a room," he said, his tone brisk. "Sure thing," I replied, pulling out the logbook. "Room 6, he added. I hesitated. "I'm sorry, sir, but room 6 is unavailable. He frowned, glancing at the nearly empty parking lot. Unoccupied, you mean? It's unavailable, I repeated firmly, trying not to let my unease show. The man's eyes narrowed, but he didn't press further. Instead, he accepted the key to room 4, though his expression remained icy. That night, strange noises started around midnight. It began as faint whispers, barely audible, but grew louder over time. By 2 a.m., it sounded like something was scraping against the walls. I checked the security cameras, but the monitors showed nothing unusual. The next morning, the man was gone. He hadn't checked out, and his briefcase sat untouched in the middle of the room. Inside was a single sheet of paper with the words, "It's watching you." I didn't know what it was, and I didn't want to find out. Over time, I learned to stop asking questions. The rules were there for a reason, and breaking them only invited trouble. I didn't need to understand the why behind them. I just needed to follow them. But not everyone listened. Late one night, a family of 4 checked in, a husband, wife, and 2 kids. They were friendly, chatty even, and I assigned them room 2 without hesitation. At 4 a.m., the father burst into the office, his wife and kids trailing behind him. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. "We're leaving," he said, slamming the room key on the counter. "You can't," I stammered, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "The rules?" "What rules?" he snapped. "Something is in that room." I tried to explain, but he wasn't listening. The family stormed out to their car, their luggage haphazardly thrown into the trunk. I watched from the window as they sped off into the night. Seconds later, their car screeched to a halt on the highway. I ran outside, but the vehicle was gone. No tire marks, no debris, nothing. It was as if they'd vanished into thin air. When I returned to the office, the room key was back on the counter. I stared at the room key sitting on the counter, cold dread washing over me. The family's faces were still fresh in my mind. The father's fear, the mother clutching her children protectively. It wasn't just their sudden disappearance that shook me. It was the impossibility of it all. I didn't know what had happened to them, and I didn't want to find out. I shoved the key back into its slot on the board and locked the office door, determined not to break another rule that night. The next morning, I debated calling the police, but what would I say? A family checked out early and vanished into thin air? They'd laugh me off the line, so I did what I always did. I kept my mouth shut and waited for the next guest to arrive. Days turned into weeks, and I fell into a rhythm. The rules became second nature, a part of my routine. I learned to recognize the signs of a bad night. Those were the nights when the wind howled louder, the vacancy sign flickered more erratically, and the air in the office felt heavier, like something unseen was pressing down on me. One of those nights, I broke my own routine. It was just past midnight, and the motel was unusually quiet. I was reviewing the guest log when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from outside the office. My stomach dropped. I glanced at the clock. 12:15 a.m. Too early for the knocking rule. Still, I hesitated. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Against my better judgment, I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door. The parking lot was empty, bathed in the dim orange glow of the overhead lights. I stepped outside, the gravel crunching under my boots, and scanned the area. Then I saw it. Room 6's door was wide open. A cold shiver ran down my spine. No one had been assigned that room. No one ever was. I approached cautiously, the flashlight trembling in my hand. "Hello?" I called, my voice barely above a whisper. The room was dark, the bed untouched, and the air inside was freezing. As I stepped through the doorway, the smell hit me, something metallic and sharp, like ozone after a lightning strike. I turned to leave, but before I could, the door slammed shut behind me. Panic surged through me as I fumbled with the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. Then I heard it. A low, guttural whisper, so close, it felt like it was right in my ear. "Leave!" The door flew open and I stumbled out, gasping for air. When I turned back, the door was closed, as if nothing had happened. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I called Mr. Givens. "What the hell is going on here?" I demanded. His voice was calm, almost too calm. "I told you to follow the rules." "This isn't normal," I snapped. "What's wrong with this place?" He sighed, a heavy sound that carried years of weariness. "The motel isn't like other places. It's different. It's been here longer than the highway, longer than me, longer than you. The rules keep it in check. Break them, and you'll see what it's really capable of." I wanted to press him for more, but he hung up before I could ask anything else. That was the last time I ever heard from him. Months passed, and I managed to keep things under control until a storm rolled in. It was a rare event in the desert, a violent thunderstorm that turned the sky a sickly shade of green. The vacancy sign buzzed louder than usual, and the power flickered on and off. That night, a woman showed up. She was drenched, her clothes clinging to her like she'd been walking in the rain for hours. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and glassy. "I need a room," she said, her voice barely audible over the storm. I hesitated. Something about her felt wrong, but I couldn't pinpoint what. Still, I handed her the key to room 7 and watched as she disappeared into the night. At 3 a.m., the knocking started. It was louder than I'd ever heard, each bang rattling the office door on its hinges. I froze, clutching the desk. "Let me in," a voice hissed. It wasn't the woman. The voice was deeper, distorted, and filled with malice. I shut my eyes, reciting the rules in my head like a mantra. Do not answer the door. Do not answer the door. Do not answer the door. The knocking stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. It was heavy, suffocating like the motel itself was holding its breath. When the sun rose, I checked room 7. The key was on the nightstand, and the room was spotless. There was no sign the woman had ever been there. The laminated list of rules sat on my desk, its edges worn and faded from constant handling. I knew every word by heart, but that didn't make it any easier. One day, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A new rule at the bottom of the list. If someone offers to take your place, say no. I stared at the words, confusion mixing with unease. The rule hadn't been there before, and I had no idea what it meant. I didn't have to wait long to find out. A week later, a man walked into the office just before closing. He was tall and thin, dressed in a black hoodie that obscured most of his face. "You must be tired," he said, his voice smooth and calm. "Why don't you let me take over?" My mouth went dry. "I'm fine," I said quickly, my hands gripping the edge of the desk. The man smiled, his teeth unnaturally sharp. "Are you sure? You've been here a long time. It's only fair to pass the torch." Every instinct screamed at me to refuse. I said no. His smile faded. For a moment, he just stared at me, his dark eyes boring into mine. Then he turned and walked out, disappearing into the desert night. I'm still here, running the Lone Star Motel. The vacancy sign flickers every night, a beacon for the lost and desperate. I've learned to live with the unease, the strange occurrences, and the unspoken threats. The rules keep me alive, and I follow them without question. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder what will happen when I'm no longer able to follow them. If you ever find yourself on a lonely desert highway and see my motel in the distance, do yourself a favor. Keep driving. Thanks for watching. If this story gave you chills, please hit that like button and subscribe for more eerie creepypastas. Until next time, stay safe and stay curious.